Namo Buddhaya. Good evening. Welcome to Buddha Dharma TV. I am Nidarsha Kuritawaku from Toronto, Canada. We begin our program, as is tradition, with a sacred service conducted by esteemed Buddhist monks. This session is led by Venerable Watala Silaratnan of Sri Lanka. To cultivate the desired tranquility, we invite you to listen to the chanting with mindful attention and peaceful heart.
다스 바그도 아라도 상마 상부다스 나모다스 바그도 아라도 상마 상부다스 나모다스 바그도 아라도 상마 상부다스 니티베소 바그와 아르항 상마
Now, let us turn our attention to Venerable Ajahn Chalo, who delivered an insightful sermon on Nibbana Sutta yesterday. His words sure to deepen our understanding and inspire us to reflect on our actions. Please join me in welcoming Ajahn Chalo of Australia as he presents another sermon on a different topic, blissful emptiness.
So I thought today that I would talk a little bit about the goal. It's a little bit difficult to talk about the goal because it's often described as empty, unconditioned, and it's kind of, I think Tanachanan calls recollecting the goal upamanusati, the highest recollection. And it's important to do because it's sometimes, emptiness is not the same as nothingness, but it's kind of difficult sometimes to motivate ourselves to experience emptiness because we're so attached to goals and getting nice stuff. That motivates much of what we do in life. And then to try to get a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, to get emptiness it is a challenge for a lot of people. So we have to put some, the other thing that motivates us, of course, is to be free from suffering. And but even that, if we do understand the goal better, then I think there will be more enthusiasm for realizing it. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. The first is the Nibbana Sutta, very small sutta, but very important. There is an unborn, unoriginated, uncreated, and unformed. If there was not this unborn, this unoriginated, this uncreated, this unformed, freedom from the world of the born, the unoriginated, the created, the formed, would not be possible. But since there is an unborn, unoriginated, uncreated, and unformed, there is, therefore, is freedom possible from the world of the born, the originated, the created, and the formed. So, those interesting Pali words, asankatam, sometimes translated as the unconditioned. So what we can observe in this world is, in terms of conditions, is things that are born, stay for some time, break apart, and cease. When the Bodhisattva decided to leave the palace, Siddhartha Gautama, looking at his wife and son, he was aware, acutely aware, that aging, sickness and death was coming for all of them. And he had this just strong intuition, resolution, conviction. There has to be something better. And his intuition is very interesting. Most of us wouldn't have it if it wasn't for Buddhas and Arahants. Many of us, we wonder what's the point of life? Is there something better? But the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, had the hypothesis, because there is a conditioned, because there is that which is bound to birth and death, there must be a deathless. And most of us wouldn't know that or wonder that. We would just wonder what the point is. So, as we know, according to the legend, he set out looking for the deathless. There's this wonderful story that's relayed when, after practicing for the jhanas, and at one point he was wandering through Rajgir, and this was before he was emaciated, practicing austerities, I assume, recently renounced, and King Bimbisara saw him wandering through the town, and he instantly knew that he was royal noble stock by his carriage and demeanor, his grace, his complexion, all these various things. So he was just wearing his one cloth. He had renounced already, he cut his hair, but just from his appearance the king knew. Oh, the king was so impressed, he had his people follow him, found out where he was and approached him and said, I'm impressed with you. I would like to offer you joint rulership of my kingdom. Can you imagine this? A king has just glimpsed you, and Rajagaha was a big kingdom. It wasn't a small kingdom. Rajagaha and Magadha were the biggest kingdoms of the day. So it's probably the equivalent of, the United States and Russia or something in India. And so the king of this great nation said, I want to give you joint rulership of my kingdom. And the Bodhisattva says, I am not seeking worldly success or pleasure. I see these things as bound up with death. I'm seeking the deathless. At which point King Bimbisara said, you can have my entire kingdom. Because he was so impressed with that answer. He's like, I want to study with this person's interesting. You imagine you're a king, you talk with these different practitioners, you meet the intellectuals of the day, the poets, the artists, you meet the impressive people. He, no doubt, had never met somebody like that. He's like, okay, I'll give it all to you. And he says, no, seriously, I'm not interested. I'm interested in the deathless. And then King Bimbisara said, well, when you discover it, come back and teach me. And that was an important meeting, because when the Lord Buddha did discover it, and after he taught his first disciples, and they realized the same deathless, he came back to Rajgir after teaching the Kassapa, the followers of the Kassapa brothers in Gaya, the 1,000 matted hair fire worshipping ascetics. So he marched into Rajgir with the over 1,000 arahants walking behind him. And King Bimbisara is famous for having offered the first monastery, the Veluvana, the bamboo grove. So the Bodhisattva knew there was a deathless. He probably had that intuition because, from what I've heard, once the Bodhisattva receives a prediction of Buddhahood, he will meet at least 20 Buddhas in those 4 asankhyas and 100,000 eons, while he is perfecting his qualities and accumulating his vast merits. So he would have heard these teachings, and he would have paid respects to many beings who had realized it. So that's why he had that strong conviction. The deathless is there, I'm going to realize it. So another thing I wanted to talk about was like, well, what's it actually like? Because it's often described as extinguish and cessation of suffering. There's not much description of, but there's one example where Sariputta is meditating, abiding in voidness, and I'd like to read from that because it kind of gives us a glimpse of what somebody meditating on the enlightened state, abiding in the enlightened state, what that might be like. to see that his emptiness, sunyata, voidness, is not nothing. After he had become securely established in the highest goal, meditation became for Sariputta a natural expression of his realization rather than a means towards some higher attainment. So the arahants can abide in their liberation. In the Sariputta Samyutta, the Venerable Ananda questioned Sariputta on several occasions about how he had passed his day. And Sariputta replied that he had spent the day dwelling in the various stages of meditative absorption, but in the case of each stage, he added, he was utterly free of self-reference. So there's no grasping at any of these states as being a self, no feeling of a self experiencing such states. I had no such thoughts as, I am entering the jhana, I have entered it, I am rising from it. On another occasion, Sariputta described to Ananda how he could enter a unique state of concentration in which he would not be cognizant of any familiar object of cognition. In regard to the earth element, he was without perception of earth, and so also in regard to the other three elements, the four immaterial objects, and everything else pertaining to this world or even in the world beyond. And yet he said he was not entirely without perception. His only perception was Nibbana is the cessation of becoming. There are other suttas where a monk is looking for the end of the universe. He thinks that if he can find the end of the universe, he'll be liberated. And he eventually comes back, and the Buddha said, you're looking in the wrong place. You need to find the place where the four elements find no footing. And so here you have Sariputta saying that he was abiding in voidness where there was no perception of the elements. So that's something that Sariputta had realized and could enter. This inscrutable attainment seems to be identical with the meditative abiding in voidness, sunyata vihara, that the Venerable Sariputta regularly cultivated. We read in the Bindabata Parisutti Sutta that the Buddha once noticed that Sariputta's features were serene and radiant, and asked him how he had acquired such radiance. Can you imagine that? The Buddha saying, oh, you look radiant today. Thank you, Lord. Sariputta replied that he frequently practiced the abiding in voidness. Thereupon the Buddha exclaimed that this was the abode of great men and proceeded to describe it in detail. The commentary identifies this abiding in voidness with the fruition attainment of arahantship. Arahatapala Samapati. It's a very interesting occasion. Upon by focusing on Nibbana's aspect of voidness, emptiness, so what is it? Emptiness of grasping at self, emptiness of grasping at permanence, emptiness of grasping at things deludedly, thinking that they give pleasure, and not grasping at the elements or any mind objects. When Sariputta became absorbed in this meditative state, even the gods from the highest heavens descended to venerate him, as the Venerable Mahakassapa testifies in the following verse. These many devas, powerful and glorious, 10,000 devas from Brahma's company, stand with joined hands worshipping him, Sariputta, wise marshal of the Dhamma, the great meditator in concentration. Homage to you, O thoroughbred man, homage to you, O supreme man. We do not know what it is, independence on which you meditate. So this is one occasion where we get a glimpse. Sariputta is abiding in voidness, and the radiance is superior to the radiance of the Brahmadevas. So much so that 10,000 Brahmadevas come down to revere it. Now the Brahmadevas are very high, right? They have access to the jhanic states, and they cannot see where, so they have the most radiant mind states in samsara, in the conditions. and they see this superior radiance, and they can't see where it's coming from. Now, of course, the reason Sariputta's radiance is able to shine into the conditioned is because he still has a body. So because his body is part of the conditions, he's in that jhanic state that you could understand it as the unconditioned, the radiance of the unconditioned is shining into the conditioned because he has a body still. Once he enters Mahaparinibbana himself, that he will abide in that radiance, his liberated mind will abide in that radiance and nobody will see, except perhaps Buddhas or other arahants. So it's just a nice little glimpse where we get to see, if when you come out of that state, the Buddha praises your complexion, you understand. See, sometimes Lord Buddha explains that his teaching is neither nihilistic or eternalistic, and that's very important. A lot of Theravadins assume that Nibbana is nihilism. We want to end the suffering. It's like some wonderful, great, grand suicide. I finally got to kill myself. I don't have to suffer anymore. Yay. Wrong view. There's no suicide there. And probably the Vajrayanists incline more towards the eternalism. They're going to be a Buddha with boundless liberation, benefits everybody. And Lord Buddha says his teaching does not fall into either of these extremes. So it's not nihilism, it's not eternalism. Why is it not eternalism? Because it doesn't degenerate from that state, so why is it not eternalism? I think the point is there's no being there that lives forever. There's a purified mind that's liberated. And so it is sometimes described as unshakable peace. Another glimpse that we get, Ajahn Chah described it as unshakable peace. Another glimpse that we get is if we know people who've attained the goal. It's an even an interesting statement, isn't it? There's the limitation of conventional language. We say, they have attained the goal. What attainment? The attainment is letting go of everything. That's what they attained. And they attained emptiness. They attained non-grasping. And what did they get? They got unshakable peace. It's pretty nice. Interesting, we get glimpses into it when Ajahn Anan said, it was Kuba Michael, one of Ajahn Anand's translators. Ajahn Anan was one of his attendants. So when you draw close to these great masters, they make interesting statements, interesting comments sometimes. And he said to Kuba Michael, because he gives teachings a couple of times a day, and he says, I'm not quite sure what to talk about sometimes. He says, sometimes I have to try to remember what it was like to suffer before I give the talk, because he wants to make it relevant to the people teaching. So he has to remember, well, what's it actually like to suffer? So you can see Ajahn Anan, he has a body, he catches colds, he has aches and pains, he appears to look tired sometimes, but there's no feeling, you project onto him that he has his personality. Ajahn Anan is like this, Ajahn Anan is like that. We're fish in water, that's how we experience our life, so we project it onto him. But that's not how he's experiencing life. He has his body, he has ailment, he has pain, and there's no self-identification with it at all, ever. And no suffering about it. That's something that's inside that we can't see. And when I went to China with Ajahn Anan, first time he went to Kuan Yin Island, Puto-san, he's made the comment, everywhere you go, all these Chinese people are staring at you. Which was true, because about more than a head taller than them, and wearing a robe. And I said, they should be staring at you because you're special. I'm just an ordinary Aussie. And I said, you have radiance to the moon. And he looked at me and he says, the radiance has no limit, he said. And he wasn't boasting. He was just saying, no, it goes further than the moon. So, I guess the Devas were looking at him, and Chinese people were looking at me. So the point is for those who attain the goal, we can see that they don't suffer. And, it's curious, it's a subtle thing, like from the outside they may appear to, but it's the body, the nature of the body, and the habits, but the mind, which is established in Nibbana, and then what that sutta describes is that the Arahant can absorb the jhanas with no sense of self. They understand the self-view, they still have volition, they can still do stuff, like they can talk to you. You go and pay respects to an Arahant, they ask, how are you? Or where have you been? Where are you going? It's one of the qualities they say that the remarkable qualities of the Buddha is that although he's enlightened, he talks in the normal conventions of the day. So it's like you can go and see this great liberated sage that isn't attached to anything and abides in emptiness, and he'll say, how are you today? And listen with kindness. And even though he doesn't think he's a self, he does understand that everyone else still does. And then he teaches a gradual training of how people can liberate themselves from their grasping and have penetrative insight. And in the Ratana Sutta that we chanted last night, there's some reference to this meditative state as well. Yam Buddha Seto Parivinayi Suching Samadhi Manantarikanya Mahu. Yam Buddha Seto Parivinayi Suching Samadhi Manantarikanya Mahu. What the excellent awakened one extolled as pure and called the concentration of unmediated knowing, Anantarikanam. No equal to that concentration can be found. This too is an exquisite treasure in the Dhamma. So that's the Dhamma. The liberated state is the Dhamma. The person experiencing it is the Buddha and the Sangha. But I wanted to just point to the fact that it's a wonderful, to think, imagine Sariputta meditating. And in his meditation experience, there's no attachment to the four elements, there's no attachment to the perceptions, there's no attachment to anything in the world of these four elements, and there's no attachment to he said, in the other world, so the heaven realms with the more subtle form. And yet, his radiance is so bright that 10,000 Brahma Devas come and revere it, because the Brahma Devas are impressed by radiance and brightness and boundlessness. That's what they've attained. But their attainment is conditioned. And with their very subtle faculties, and they're able to see there's a difference. This radiance is superior, it's brighter, it's clearer. For monks who have divine eye, I'm fortunate because I know a few of them, they can see the quality of your meditation at a glance, because they can see with their physical eye and they can see with their mind's eye as well. So they see your physical body and they see your subtle body. If you have some samadhi but not very good mindfulness and wisdom, you will have a bright mind. But it's a bit like one of these light bulbs. If you have good mindfulness and wisdom, it's a bright and clear light around you. So if you just got out of bed and didn't meditate and you're feeling a bit grumpy, you have a clouded, dull, grey light. But if you purify your mind, you have diamond-like clarity. And they can see that at a glance. This one's got samadhi, this one's got samadhi and insight, this one's completely liberated. And then they can also see how much merit you have, because that will affect how far the radiance shines around you. So they know. They will know this one's been accumulating merits for many lifetimes because they're... I asked one of these teachers how they could tell the difference between when an ordinary deva and a bodhisattva came to visit. And he said, like a high-level bodhisattva with a prediction of Buddhahood. Because he was saying, they don't really have 1,000 arms. That's a conventional metaphors to help us understand their qualities, but they just look like ordinary Tushita devas, gold, see-through. I said, well, how can you tell the difference? He says, oh, well, when a high-level bodhisattva, because devas have an extent of their radiance, but when a high-level bodhisattva comes, I can't see where their radiance ends. So it fills the sky, as far as that great master's divine eye has a capacity to see. So, the point I'm making is all of your practice brings results, whether you see it or not. It's accumulating merits. The efforts you make at cultivating clarity and mindfulness brings results. And the goal, being able to abide in the bliss of having realized emptiness with no grasping at anything, is superior, say the wise. The Brahma Devas revere it. The Buddha praises the radiance. So I just wanted to offer these reflections to encourage you that the goal is worth striving for, and happy striving.
Let's take a brief pause to enjoy a beautiful song titled Lotus Seeds, a profoundly meaningful and spiritual uplifting hymn. This is a PowerPoint presentation featuring Buddhist hymns with Dharma Point for reflections.
Like the seeds of the lotus we are, with the sunshine and rain will grow. Standing virtuously above the muddy water, soon a pure white lotus we shall be. The pure nature in us he realized, with the Dhamma he shines the path. Carefully and patiently to us he shows the way. Like the seeds of the lotus we are, with the sunshine and rain will grow. Standing virtuously above the muddy water, so the pure white lotus we shall be. A great teacher who runs seas, with love and kindness he guides us. Gone are the impurities, one by one, perfect Buddha we shall be. Like the seeds of the lotus we are, with the sunshine and rain will grow. Standing virtuously above the muddy water, soon a pure white lotus we shall be. The great teacher to us he is, with love and kindness he guides us. Gone are the impurities, one by one, perfect Buddha we shall be.
Please join us for upcoming Enlighten talk with Venerable Aya Khanda of United Kingdom. She encountered Dharma in 1996 and dedicated the next 10 years to sitting and serving different monasteries in India and Nepal. Please welcome Venerable Khanda to deliver her sermon on the topic, Healing with Self-Confidence.
Good. Is the sound okay for everyone? Because I don't have my headphones in. I'm hoping it's just as good without the headphones. Yeah, super. Excellent. I'm speaking quite softly, so if that's working, it's great. It's less effort for me as well. Compassion to my vocal cords. So, I hope you enjoyed that meditation. Sometimes it's nice to focus directly on the freedom from suffering and the potential for that freedom. And that is actually a definition that comes from the Tibetan tradition. So they define compassion as the felt wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Which is a really lovely definition, but I think there's one thing missing from there, which has been covered by other psychologists and other groups. There's a place called, I think it's the Good Life Center, and they say that it's the response that arises when witnessing the suffering of others that motivates a desire to help. Yeah, so it then moves into this kind of sense of action, taking action where it's necessary. So it's not only a sentiment, but it also has to manifest in daily life, you know, in a wise response. And it was very nice because obviously a lot of us have been aware of the things that have been happening in the news at the moment. And one of them, of course, is this brutal killing of George Floyd in America. And, you know, some very, very upsetting footage. That in a way is a relief that we've been able to see that, because these things have been going on for long enough without us really realizing it or wanting to know. And I really liked one of the responses that another nun put up on the Facebook recently, and I just wanted to read it out because it also addresses this idea of suffering and the causes of suffering. And this is directly from the Buddhist suttas. It's from the Chakravarti Sihananda Sutta. I don't know that sutta actually. And this is where the king asks the Buddha for advice on how to address violence in his kingdom. And the Buddha replied, highlighting that it was because the king failed to provide money to the poor that poverty increased and violence ensued. And he says, in this way, monks, money not being given to the poor, poverty flourished, and because poverty flourished, theft flourished. Because theft flourished, weaponry flourished. And because weaponry flourished, murder flourished. So here she made a very nice comment. This is Venerable Soma in New York. She said his advice was to give money to the poor and not to stop telling people to be violent. Sorry, not to tell people to stop being violent. Of course, in other suttas, the Buddha totally condemns, and nowhere in the suttas does he ever condone violence. So I just want to get that really clear from the outset. You know, he says that only love can appease hatred. By hatred, hatred is never appeased. But the point here is that he wasn't judging people's response. He was actually saying, don't expect oppressed people to behave in one way or another, but address the causes of distress at its source. Once you eliminate the reasons for people to protest, there won't be any protest to address at all. So I thought that was very timely and relevant, and also ties in with this definition of suffering and the causes of suffering. It's not enough just to say, may we be free from suffering, may all beings be free from suffering. We actually have to look at what's underneath that suffering and address that and address the causes. So in the suttas, compassion is described as one of the boundless, immeasurable states of mind. It's also called Cheta Vimutti, which means a liberation of mind. And that liberation of mind, of course, is liberation from what we call the 5 hindrances. So it's not final liberation. That only comes around through wisdom that can be developed on the back of these Brahma Viharas. But it does undermine the hindrances to the extent that we can enter deep states of samadhi. And the 5 hindrances, again, are based on greed, hatred, and delusion. Sensual desire, hatred, cruelty, animosity, negativity and anger, doubt, restlessness, sloth and torpor are the classic 5 hindrances that we're aiming to liberate our mind from. And compassion is particularly focused on overcoming the motivation or tendency for cruelty to arise. So it's the direct antidote to cruelty. And the Buddha says in the Majjhima Nikaya 20, 2 kinds of thought, he actually says that whenever a thought of cruelty arises in the mind, you have abandoned thoughts of compassion to cultivate that cruelty. So just by allowing these thoughts in the mind and neglecting compassion, which cannot coexist with thoughts of cruelty, you're actually allowing that cruelty to flourish. And obviously the converse side of that is that by developing compassion, we're actually crowding out the mind with so many good qualities. We're filling it up with these feelings of benevolence, thoughts of freedom from suffering, wanting another's release from suffering, that cruelty has no place to abide. Yeah, and these Brahma Viharas are called divine abidings because they're places where even the Devas, the Brahmas, the so-called godly beings in the Buddhist texts dwell. And we can make these places our dwelling homes in everyday life. Yeah? Many of us might be well practiced with metta. A lot of you have been coming to my metta groups. And compassion is just another way that love manifests itself. You can almost see the 4 Brahma Viharas as different ways that love expresses itself according to what it comes in contact with. In other words, it's an appropriate response of love. So if you meet somebody who's suffering, especially if they're in deep turmoil, deep grief and agony, especially after witnessing something like this killing, it isn't sensitive in any way to say, well, may you be happy. I mean, they're far from happy. Their immediate concern at that time is to be free from oppression, free from suffering, and free from the causes of suffering. Yeah, so compassion manifests in response to suffering, and it's a way to alleviate that suffering. It's really nice because I was practicing metta one day, and it gave me a sort of experiential understanding of how these Brahma Viharas almost meld into each other and also are quite natural when they meet various situations, because I was practicing metta quite intensively. And I just changed my object from my best friend to a lady in Burma who used to support me, quite a poor lady, and who'd had a very difficult life. She'd lost one of her daughters in India to asthma when her daughter was only about 25. And actually, subsequently, her son died too, who was the main breadwinner in the family. And he was living in Calcutta and sending money home to Burma. Nevertheless, this lady was incredibly kind and even travelled all the way from her village, which was a couple of hours, to make a little tiffin tin. They're like these little metal tins full of the food that I could eat when I was really sick, like some very simple khichdi and some prawns. And there was very little I could eat at that time. And so she would do anything. She'd really go out of her way to help others. And so I started saying metta to her just out of gratitude. And lo and behold, the whole feeling of that metta started to change into what I would recognize and identify as compassion. And I found that so incredibly intuitive, like as though love has its own wisdom, innate within it. that it responded in that way when she came to mind. And shortly after that, I carried on with the same words of loving kindness, I think, but just with this sense of compassion and a real opening of heart to suffering, and I guess to the universal suffering of beings. I mean, if you have lived in poor countries or in any countries where there's maybe racism or oppression or disease, famine, and all the other difficulties that we experience but are so much more evident in certain places, it does engender this really deep sense of connection with existential suffering, the fact that this is part and parcel of human life. And in fact, for most of us here, the fact that we can come to a Dhamma talk this evening from the comfort of our own homes implies that we're probably in the top 1% of the population in terms of resources, safety, privilege, wealth, comfort, etc., even though we have our struggles. So going to these places and sort of getting that sense of the universality of suffering really helps this compassion to broaden and expand. And from there, I found my heart just went into a sense of equanimity. It just went into this sense of, there are beings born into this world, into samsara, and we're going to suffer no matter what in our own ways. And a real sense of perspective and peace with that. But this came as a result of the other Brahma Viharas. It didn't just jump to the equanimity without going through some of that ability to actually meet and face suffering. And I think this is so, so important, because what can often happen with compassion is that, well, actually it's not with compassion, it's one of the scientific definitions now has, and also some of the neurological research has shown that empathy and compassion are actually, can go hand in hand, but are actually very different qualities. Yeah. So compassion really focuses on the wish for freedom from suffering. And as such, it's a very happy state of mind because it's focusing on that freedom, that happiness. Yeah. It's not getting sunk in the suffering. And it's more like feeling for another, feeling for another. Yeah. Feeling for them, feeling for their pain, wanting them to come out of suffering. Whereas empathy is more of a resonance with that suffering. It's more of a feeling with them. So you're actually in somebody else's shoes, and it's almost as though you take on some of their pain. And I'm definitely very empathic, and I can sort of sense people's pain quite quickly. And I guess also their happiness and joy, which is also very nice in a sense. And I think the empathy also, I respect that quality in myself, and I don't want to sort of say that this is a negative thing. But the danger with empathy is that when it becomes too strong, it can lead to empathetic distress. So what the neuroscientists used to call compassion fatigue has been proven now in neuroscience to actually be empathy fatigue, not compassion fatigue. Because compassion lights up different areas of the brain which are associated with positive emotions and the soothing affiliative systems of the brain. Whereas empathy actually can light up the pain centers in the brain, right? But empathy has two courses. First of all, you see that suffering, you resonate, you respond, and that's a good thing, that's a healthy thing. But from there, it can either lead into empathetic distress, if you're too focused on the suffering and getting embroiled in that, getting really bogged down in that, and just focusing on the suffering and the pain. Or it can lead to compassion, which is a much less, surprisingly less self-centered emotion, because you're not so caught up with what's called distress tolerance. Like lack of tolerance, I guess. So the painful emotions come up in empathy, but you don't have tolerance to face them. You get bogged down, they can make you ill, they can lead to burnout. Whereas with compassion, you have more capacity to manage distress, to cope with difficult feelings, to cope with anxiety or depression. It actually gives you resources and improves your health. Yeah, it has an effect on the immune system. So there's a difference there, but I think it's important to remember that, because I was always a little concerned when people said compassion is so distinct from empathy that it's almost, I don't know, I interpreted it as though they were separate, but they're not separate. It's just that we have to be careful not to go into empathetic distress. Yeah, so compassion is focusing on that freedom of suffering, and compassion can never be too strong. you can develop as much compassion as possible. And the more you develop it, the more you incline your mind to compassion, the more that becomes your character. Yeah. The Buddha said, whatever we frequently reflect and ponder upon becomes the inclination of our mind. And these then become the Brahma Viharas, the places that we can frequently dwell in and frequently resort to as a refuge and as a source of nourishment and healing as well. Yeah. So these are states of love, and love which is directly connected to suffering, to the suffering of beings. So actually compassion requires a lot of courage. You know, there's such a thing as fierce compassion. And even just today, I was telling my co-hosts, I put up something on my Facebook page, just, you know, a petition to sign to support, well, justice in America, basically. And it was interesting, the responses that provoked, mostly very supportive, but some were not. And some seemed to question even, you know, the fact of a nun standing up for what she thinks is right. I mean, I feel that as a spiritual leader, I have a moral imperative to speak out against violence, and I will do that. But that really did bring about quite a lot of backlash, and I got a particularly nasty private message from somebody who'd been arguing on that page. And, you know, I think that everyone on that page was very respectful in their approach with this person, but I got a very nasty, outrightly abusive message. And it was clearly intended to sort of intimidate me into not taking a stand. And it just made me realize that compassion has to be brave, it has to be strong, it has to be bold. You know, because people will want you to retreat. They will want to intimidate you, especially if you're speaking up for something that may impact on their rights or their privileges. Yeah? And so compassion isn't this kind of, it's not going to make you soft or weak. I really love what Jacinda Ardern says, actually. She says that empathy doesn't make you weak, it can be a strength. And I think that's manifested in her leadership. You know, she obviously has a lot of compassion and empathy, and that's what makes her so strong and effective as a leader. So how does all this relate to self-compassion? This is the big question, isn't it? Because most of us, I think, can develop compassion towards others fairly easily or fairly naturally, at least from time to time, when various situations come to mind that are, you know, in need of compassion. But self-compassion sometimes carries with it a resistance and a few obstacles. Yet the Buddha did say that we have to develop compassion as metta, as sympathetic joy and equanimity to all as to oneself, not only to others, but to oneself, and ideally from the starting place with oneself. So why do we have so many mental blocks to compassion? And I think I already touched on one of them, which is this fear that we'll become weak. Yeah? And that's just confusing compassion with a kind of submissiveness or a kind of selfishness, or even an indulgence, you know, that to give myself compassion is quite indulgent, I don't really deserve it, you know, I should be thinking about others. And sometimes we have this sort of such a strong inner tyrant or inner critic that we actually find that an obstacle to developing self-compassion, as though we have to be perfect in order to deserve our own empathy and care. But the Buddha is not saying that we have to be perfect at all. It's not about curing, as Ajahn Brahm always says. He usually says a doctor's job is not to cure, it's to care. So in meditation, we become our own doctor in a sense. We're not looking into our body and mind, at our emotions in order to cure them, to fix them, to change them, but just to care about them, to open up to them and to understand what's really happening. And that includes, with compassion, that includes soothing oneself, being able to soothe. So mindfulness, in a sense, says, this is difficult. It becomes aware of the difficulty, aware of the suffering. This is anxiety, or this is depression, or this hurts. My knee just hurts. Compassion says, how can I care for this? So there's a slight difference there. It's like something additional to bare mindfulness. The other nice little, Ajahn Brahm calls it kindfulness, but he also has another definition, which is related to this fella. This is my Ajahn bear. So when I practice looking at this bear, I'm practicing bear awareness. So, so that's his other little definition of compassion and kindness mixed with the mindfulness. Bear awareness as opposed to B-A-R-E, which is sometimes we think it's bare, but it's actually not, because we're just carrying our conditioned tendencies with it. If we have a tendency for self-criticism, whatever we're aware of, we're just judging it the whole time, right? But if you add that compassion, that kindness to the way that you're aware, it's actually undermining negativity, ill will, and cruelty, self-cruelty, which we can carry with us, being far too judgmental and critical of ourselves. Sometimes we can have self-compassion if we feel our life's going well and we're doing well, and it's a sense of, yeah, you know, I'm okay with myself. But then when we slip up or maybe make mistakes, suddenly that compassion just disappears. So it wasn't really a very deep and penetrative self-compassion. It was quite superficial, because compassion allows us to make mistakes. It doesn't expect perfection. As I said in the meditation, it's the way a Buddha would regard us, right? With so much compassion, you're making mistakes because you're human, because you're doing the best you can, given your input, given your information available, given your conditioning, and all the resources you have at hand, whether internal or external. But you are a human being, and it's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn. Yeah. So that shouldn't be a reason to deprive ourselves of this self-compassion. And then another really interesting thing that one of the psychologists, Paul Gilbert, discovered is that sometimes people are, and I think I've also seen this in myself, sometimes we're afraid to give ourselves self-compassion because we're afraid that once we start to care, we'll suddenly realize how in need of our own love we really are, and how we've deprived ourselves for so long of that care. Yeah. Or how lonely we are. And we don't want to meet that loneliness. We're afraid that it's going to overwhelm us. And so this self-compassion seems a little bit intimidating. It's easier to just carry on being busy and getting involved in things and pushing our way ahead in life. You know, we're worried that if we take a step back and just care for ourselves, we won't be able to function in the same way in the world. Again, this is actually the opposite thing that happens with compassion. We become more resourced to face difficulties and obstacles, and to have a clearer mind and a better way to discern the right decisions that we have to make in everyday life. So I want to talk a bit about how we actually start to practice this self-compassion. And again, drawing on some research that I've been listening to, I've joined this online retreat with Bhikkhu Analayo, who's a very famous scholar of Buddhism and also practitioner. He does a lot of meditation. I think he spends at least half his week in personal meditation. And he's doing this course on mindfulness, which is really quite deep. And each lesson looks at a particular theme. So the last lesson was compassion and empathy and mindfulness. And there was a lecturer called Diego somebody, who I forget his name, but he was a neuroscientist, and he looked at all these studies on empathy and compassion, as I said, but also one which was really interesting about the way that we're aware. And he said there are 3 different ways in this particular study that people trained in compassion. One way was just to train in mindfulness, just to train in presence, being aware of distress, their own distress, you know, just coming in contact with that. And that group, actually, when they were tested in a stressful situation, had higher stress levels than the control group, because they were more aware of their pain and distress, and they didn't have the tools to cope with that. Yeah. The group that then combined, these were people that were doing, the previous group, the presence group, were people that were just doing breath meditation and body scan, okay, plain body scan. The next group were the affective group, and they were practicing something more akin to compassion. So they were doing loving kindness practices, probably compassion practices too, and also having discussions with each other about how compassion felt, right? And when those groups were put in a stressful situation, their results, their stress levels were lower than the ones that just practiced with presence. But then there was another group, and they added something called perspective. And I find this really interesting, because this is not my strength. My strength is probably the compassion and the loving kindness, but not always the perspective, right? That's more like the equanimity, the standing back and observing. So the perspective was something to do with being able to understand and objectively observe and work with one's thoughts and emotions. So to actually be able to start working with those thoughts and emotions. So I wanted to talk a bit about these in sort of how they can work together from a Buddhist perspective. And what I always try to do in the meditation, aware that right effort is so important on the path and precedes right mindfulness, I always try to infuse any awareness practice with that warmth, with that kindness, as a way of looking, a way of regarding experience. So that's the bear awareness, right? You all need to get a teddy bear. Somebody sent me this anonymously, which is the epitome of kindness and compassion, because it's a beautiful bear and it reminds me about self-compassion and bear awareness. So we actually add this kindness into the way that we're aware, as though that kindness is flowing with your awareness. Wherever the awareness goes, the kindness follows, like the light and warmth of the sun. Yeah, so it's like a way of befriending yourself, a way of caring for yourself, and becoming intimate with experience. Yeah. And this can also carry a sense of perspective with it, because in order to understand how we relate to something, we have to see that there's an object there and there's something watching here. This is just an illustration, it's not literal. But the way I like to see it is there's sort of the observer here and the observed here, and in between that there's a space. And in that space is the relationship between the two. So it's really the same thing as if you meet a friend and you're having a conversation. It's not just you say something, then they say something. Between you, there's an energy. Between you, there's a certain way of relating. You can either feel that there's some tension there, or you might feel that there's kindness and warmth there. There's a certain attitude there. And if you kind of fill up that space with kindness, the person who enters that space feels respected, feels that this is a friendly place to be. Right? So in the same way, we can make our mind a friendly place to be by adding that kind of right intention, the intentions of loving kindness, compassion, gentleness, and letting go rather than desire and clinging and wanting. We can add these to the way that we're aware. And hopefully a lot of you are quite well practiced in that by now, or at least can take a step back when you realize you are getting sucked in and just do a slight tweak in your attitude. And this has worked so well for me in so many situations. I've been kind of sitting, feeling disturbed, feeling like I think I'm being compassionate, and I'm kind of staying with it and feeling the pain. And at a moment I realize, oh, there's a resistance here. I'm being with it so that it goes away. There's a slight agenda. And at that moment, if you catch yourself and you can actually change the way you're observing to a compassionate way of observing, as though you're getting in touch with a wiser, more compassionate part of yourself, and from that place you look at your experience, and in a moment it can just flip and even give way. Not only the suffering releases, but it can give rise to immediate feeling of peace or even bliss. And this has happened so many times to me, sometimes quickly, sometimes more gradually, as that attitude starts to become refined and I can add more and more kindness and care into the experience. Another way of doing this, of course, is to do what we did just now and to kind of evoke feelings and an atmosphere of safety and kindness by maybe imagining a being, maybe a Buddha, maybe a teacher. Sometimes I sit myself between the Buddha, Ajahn Brahm, and my other two main teachers on either side. And I just let myself dwell in that environment, in that atmosphere, and soak it up. And it's very beautiful. It also contributes to the letting go aspect of meditation. It's like, I'm here, you do the work. I've turned up, let the teachings take over. It's kind of an attitude of just giving yourself to the practice without trying to control or expect anything in return. And then, yeah, like a safe place is also a good thing. And this psychologist, Paul Gilbert, he's written a big fat book on compassion. I would totally recommend it. And I'm not always into like psychology, but it has heaps and heaps of Buddhist related practices in it. It's about this big. And it's wonderful, Paul Gilbert. And in there he talks about having like a compassionate friend. So you develop this being so that you can readily draw on that imagery or on that sense of their presence whenever you need to. And also a compassionate place. Yeah. So like I was saying, maybe a place where the sun's setting and the waves of the sea are just lapping up on the shore, or whatever else. You might be under a nice big copper beech tree like I am fairly often in the park. And so I really recommend this book. But as well as that, what I found quite helpful with presence, with being aware in a kind way, is to notice when I'm getting sucked into the difficult emotions or the difficult sensations, and just notice that my mind's getting contracted, it's getting pulled in. It's what they call negativity bias. We like to find the suffering and focus on it and fix it. And sometimes we just need to pull back and give it space. So you can actually energetically shift your awareness from, say, being very tightly contracted or focused on an area to being wider. And this may include just staying with the outside of the body, or even spreading your awareness beyond your body into the room. I was doing this during one period of my life, which was very, it was like one of those crisis points, like a turning point where you don't know what you're doing. And I was just literally without anything. I think there was no more support, and even my parents had said they're not going to pay for my ticket to Australia that year. And I was kind of stuck in England, and I didn't know what was going to happen next. And there were quite a lot of difficult emotions coming up, just kind of a sense of heaviness and almost like crushing inward on my body. And I just kept on for that whole 3 weeks of self-retreat. My practice was to keep expanding, keep going outward, expand, feel the whole body, feel the whole room. And by the end of those 3 weeks, my whole energy had changed. I just felt incredibly light and really ready for the next step. And that preceded beginning Anukampa. That was right at the start of Anukampa. And so my attitude to being sort of so-called stranded suddenly shifted. And I thought, no, this is my challenge now. And this is a wonderful thing to be doing. So that was wonderful. And that's quite an effective way to practice, in the sense that you're not avoiding the difficult feelings. You're with them. You just give them a bigger container. Yeah, you're not like trying to bypass them or kind of go to the breath and focus on the breath and avoid all those feelings and just get away from it. You're actually including it so that your mind can have an expansive sense of calm. And then when the breath arises, you can be with that breath in its entirety, and it almost just fills the whole body and mind until the body starts to fade and becomes very, very light. Yeah, so this is a really nice way to work as well. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the thoughts and how to work with thoughts. I came up with this little acronym, RRASS, to help me remember a sort of sequence that I usually work with when I'm working with thoughts. So RRASS is like RAS. So the whole point of this is to start to sort of come out of being a victim of our thinking process, to get a bit of a perspective on where our thoughts are leading us, and to try to learn to guide thinking in a wholesome and helpful way. Yeah, because thoughts have so much power. You can just experiment yourself, put a negative thought in there and feel the resonance of that. Put a positive thought in there, feel how that feels. It's totally different. And yet we can become so kind of fixated on seeing things a certain way. We sort of keep going down these loops and particular pathways that are just leading us to more and more stress. And I do it myself still from time to time, and my thinking seems so real at that point. And I've lost all perspective on the fact that I'm not in a very good mood to begin. So, of course, my thinking is going to be a little bit negative. It's not to be believed. I don't know about people here, but I find that one of the common denominators for me being in a bit of a low mood, it's almost always tiredness. It's bound to lead to more negative thinking and a lower mood, just because I don't have the energy of the mind at that time. So self-compassion can include going to bed on time and, really looking after yourself in a proper way, looking after your body, cooking yourself nice food, being out in nature for long enough, and not just staying in the home. Even if it is dangerous to get out, there's ways to do it. You can go out early morning, you can wear a mask if you feel more protected that way. There are things we can do to really nourish ourselves, and that do show a certain sense of self-compassion. They also help when you are stuck with the thinking, and you're just getting kind of down a rabbit hole. Just open up again, feel the nature, listen to the birds, get that perspective, that standing back. So anyway, to go through my little acronym, it starts with R for recognize. So this is where we recognize the content of the thought, right? but we recognize the content of the thought, not in a kind of very judgmental and hostile way, like, oh, look at this is terrible, but in a kind and gentle way. Just recognize what's present. Yeah, that's the first step. So that's that awareness again, that mindfulness. And then the second step is to relax, especially if the thinking is distressing or disturbing in any way, just to relax and get that sense of context. You know, maybe go to the breath, do a gentle body scan, and just get some presence established, first of all. So that's why we usually start with the breath or the body, just to establish ourselves in the present moment. And that already can help to bring us out of the conceptualizing mind. And then the next thing is to accept those thoughts. So to take away the struggle, you know, these shouldn't be here. Why are these here? I shouldn't be having this thought. I always think like this. This is terrible. Or to just be believing and rolling in those thoughts. Yeah, that's not really accepting. So accepting means kind of understanding that they're there and even validating them. You know, okay, it's okay to have this thought and to empathize with that. You know, it's quite understandable that I'd be thinking this way. I didn't have a lot of sleep. I watched something disturbing on the news. You know, this is the way I've been conditioned to think. So we can accept that thinking so that we have some amount of objectivity around it. And then the next thing is to stand back from that and to recognize whether that thought is leading to your benefit or to your harm. Yeah? So we accept it because we have to understand what's happening, but then we stand back and we say, okay, is this thought worth keeping or not? And the Buddha was very clear again in the Majjhima Nikaya, 2 types of thought it's called. Yeah, 2 types of thought, and it's 2 types of 3 thoughts. So on the one hand, you have thoughts of love and kindness, thoughts of compassion, and thoughts of letting go or renunciation, giving away. And on the other side, you have thoughts, the opposite 3, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of anger or animosity, thoughts of cruelty, again, the opposite of compassion, thoughts of cruelty and harm, and thoughts of desire, sensual desire in particular. And the Buddha said he recognized those 3, you know, which ones they were, whether they were the wholesome ones or the unwholesome ones. And after recognizing that, he rationalized with himself, well, is this leading to my benefit or not? Is it leading to enlightenment or not? And when he realized it wasn't, he abandoned those thoughts. And in another sutta, it actually says he substituted. This was the first method to start to overcome the negative thinking, was to substitute the unwholesome thought with a more wholesome thought. So that's the 5th one, substitution. Yeah. So when we substitute, we guide our mind towards more compassionate thoughts. And I really like, again, I think it was, I forget who said this, but somebody said you can even have thoughts about the thought. So what you can do instead of saying, oh, this is all so terrible, I'm hopeless, it's all going wrong, is take one little step back and say, oh, I'm having the thought that this is terrible and this is going wrong. Yeah. So that's a thought about the thought. It's still the thought, but you're recognizing that there's someone having the thought. That means you're a little bit separate from the thought. The thought is not you, right? So this is one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is actually empathize with those thoughts. As I said before, you can add a different thought, such as, oh, I'm sorry to hear that you're feeling that way, but it's understandable. You know, you've had a hard day, and you know your friend didn't call when she said she'd call, and I know you really value reliability, and you can actually talk to yourself the way that a friend might talk to you, right? So this is again where you can bring in this compassionate imagery, the compassionate friend, and imagine how they might respond if you had that thought. They probably console you, soothe you, you know, try to turn it in a different way, so that you're not just going down this track of, oh my goodness, everything's going wrong, nobody loves me, yeah, just because you had a thought. And it's so difficult to, you know, not to get hooked on thoughts sometimes. They seem to have so much truth to them, and yet they're never true to reality. Thoughts are always one step away from feelings, one step away from reality. And then another way of thinking or speaking to yourself is just the outright substitution of the unwholesome thought with the thought of compassion. And that's what we were doing earlier in the meditation. If any one of you tried that, it was just to inject a thought there, a thought that points the mind to freedom from suffering. May I be free from suffering. I did this the other day. I watched that terrible video, and I'm glad I've watched it because we need to know what's happening. But I watched it at the wrong time of day. It was quite interesting because when Ananda Bodhi came on to give a talk a couple of days ago, she also watched it at the wrong time of day, right before bed. I don't know why. Maybe nuns are always busy right up until then or something. Or that's our only kind of personal time or something. But I found myself sickened to the point of wanting to vomit, like I almost had to run to the bathroom. And then I found my breath was very strong, like really. And I just stayed with that. And I realized presence is not enough because it's late night and I need to sleep. So I just added, may all beings be free from suffering. And I just kept on saying that and focusing on that freedom from suffering. May they all be free from suffering. May they all be free from suffering. And gradually, I just soothed myself to sleep. So this is really powerful because if we are able to soothe ourselves, we're also able to open up to suffering when it's necessary to, and not to recoil or withdraw or bypass the problems in the world. Sometimes we need to speak up when it's important to. That's what's called being an ally, or manifesting thoughts of compassion into speech, into action. This is very much part of the Buddhist path. The Buddha always said that not to kill doesn't only mean to abstain from killing, it also means to protect life. With rod and weapon laid aside, compassionate to all beings, protecting the life of all beings. Yeah, and speaking words that go to the heart, that heal divisions, that unite the divided. Yeah, this is straight from the Buddhist text, Majjhima Nikaya 51. So this is really important, and I think this also stops the empathy that we may have going into empathetic distress and trauma. And it's from the place when it does go into that empathetic distress that we don't have the capacity to respond wisely anymore. And it is more likely that further violence will accrue. Yeah. I often sort of look at these kind of things and I just think, with all the rioting that was happening in America, it's coming from a place of trauma and distress. And if people had more of an ability to generate compassion for their own suffering before taking action, then they'd be coming from a different place and it wouldn't be so likely to lead into unwholesome ways of responding. And this is not to judge them because I understand, that we can't understand. I understand that we can't understand the trauma that's happened to those communities, the Black communities in America in particular. Yeah. But if we can develop compassion and focus on that freedom from suffering, starting with oneself, then we have a chance to really generate compassion in all the directions, just as we do with the metta. The Buddha said, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. I will abide, pervading one quarter, all quarters, that means all around and above and below, with compassion. To all as to oneself. Yeah, so this is the practice, and we can start from where we are in daily life and in our discussions with others, in the way we use our privilege, if we have privilege, and in ways that really heal some of the suffering in the world. But I really want to encourage you to learn compassion for yourself because it will build up that tolerance to difficult feelings, to anxiety, to stress, and help you to focus and be proactive in the freedom from suffering for yourself and for all beings. Okay? So I think that's all for tonight.
Like the seeds of the lotus we are, with the sunshine and rain will grow. Standing purchasely above the muddy water, soon a pure white lotus we shall be. The great teacher to us he is, With love and kindness he guides us. Gone are the impurities, one by one, perfect Buddha we shall be.
That wraps up today's broadcast. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact us at info@buddhadharmatv.com. We work hard to share the noble, peaceful, and sublime teaching of Buddhas with you, helping you pursue the spiritual path under his wisdom. Please encourage those who's interested in rational and enlightened teaching of Buddha. Thank you for watching. We believe our program on Buddha Dharma TV will inspire peace lovers around the globe. I am Nidar Chakurituaku. Good night. Namo Buddhaya.